Captain David Greer, welcome back to the show, sir.
Good to see you.
So we were in touch this morning, was questioning maybe what technological or engineering advancements had been made over the years or attempted over the years to make these rafts that you've described at length over time on the show to steer or navigate most easily for the pilot on duty. And a few memories came to mind that you were sharing with me, and I'd like to discuss that some more as we go. You mentioned some alternative designs of barges over the years. I'd like to know your memories of those and which ones move the best, hydrodynamic differences of each, to whatever degree you can speak. And then we'll kind of get into maybe what could be one day.
Well, first of all, uh, almost everything we do in our industry was pioneered by what was called the Inland Waterways Corporation. It became later on the Federal Barge Line, but it was started, I think, in
Please do make sure to fill me in on Federal. I've never heard where they've come from, actually.
well, the Inland Waterways Corporation. I think they created it and right after World War One, in about 1919, I think, maybe 1918, uh, they discovered, after the United States got into the war, that our transportation system was ill prepared for moving men and materials across the continent. Uh, to it was so we didn't have sufficient rail facilities. We certainly didn't have any highway facilities, and our rivers were not particularly suited to it either. So that they saw real advantage in having an inland waterway, the cape that was navigable, inside the boundaries of the nation itself, right down the middle where, it couldn't be bombed or no armies could approach or, where it was really safe to move men and materials and whatever in bulk. And that's kind of when you had the towing industry came back. It was virtually at an end uh, right around that time. I think they had a big ice storm in I don't remember when it was 1915 or something like that that destroyed a lot of the steamboat fleet, Cincinnati and St. Louis and places like that. Now you still had the well, I think actually I think that the what had been the combine, which was a bunch of steel and coal producers in the Ohio River Valley who built these big boats like the Sprague and put together these record tows and would sort of ride a weather front down the river, a flood. And uh, they were still, by 1920, I'm pretty sure that the Sprague and some of those big boats had gone to work for Standard Oil Company in Baton Rouge, the refinery about that time, and they went all over the place with oil barges. And exactly what those oil barges look like, I don't know. They were wooden hull, whatever they were, I think. You still had wooden hulls created as early as late as the middle of World War II. Wooden hull barges built. But the Federal Barge Line uh, was at federal expense, U.S. tax dollars, provided that and created where there was no industry, they created an industry. and they were very innovative. The DPC steamboats uh, later on during the late 30s and up into World War II were Federal barge line boats by that time. But they used steamboats, of course, but they had all kinds of every kind of barge you can imagine. They even had these barges that were pointed. They were very narrow barges, but pointed on each end, and you could fit them in a tow like putting together a puzzle. Of course, they held those things together probably with lines, where they had steel plated or iron plated timber heads, but those things were held together probably with hemp lines. I don't know. So a lot of the innovation that we uh, take for granted these days about our industry came from the Federal Barge Line. They were renamed the Federal Barge Line. I'm not exactly sure when, sometime between the wars. And then later on in the 50s, the Federal Barge Line was created as an independent commercial enterprise. And exactly when that was, I don't know. But I'll tell you where you can find out. And if anybody's interested in that, the St. Louis Mercantile Library has the Herman Pott room collection, steamboat river collection. And that's probably anything you would want. They probably have all the old log books and records of everything that the Inland Waterways Corporation and the Federal Barge Line did. There were other, barge lines. It was a valley line of some sort, but and in the 30s, I think Canal Barge Company got started. ACBL was operating on the Ohio River. I don't know whether if they were coming down the lower. They weren't ACBL at the time. I'm not sure what they were, but the uh, the the big boy in town was the Federal Barge Line in the Waterway Corporation, and
And
they're the ones.
what became of them?
Well, they became the Federal Barge Line. The name was changed, and later they privatized it. I think after World War II, they privatized the Federal Barge Line so that somebody bought it, or bought into it,
Right, but
or
you're not sure who?
no, I'm not. I know.
Okay.
I really don't know. It's a huge collection, the Herman Pott collection. I'm sure Herman Pott himself had a lot to do with that. Uh, but I regret that while I could get around pretty well, I didn't spend several weeks in that collection. It'd be very interesting. Somebody should look into it. I'm sure scholars do, but somebody who's actually understands the industry should look at that because there's such a wealth of information there.
You,
There's
you,
several other collections.
you certainly caught my interest in that. I need to look into where was the Herman Pot collection? Where?
In St. Louis. It's the St. Louis Mercantile Library. I think it's in downtown St. Louis. Old library. Been around for a long time. They have probably every issue of the Waterways Journal that was ever published. They may have it on microfiche, I don't know, or they may have it online by now. I'm not sure about that. But they have all of that. And that's would be an interesting collection itself. I found a lot of uh, Waterways journals going back around the turn of the century. I think Waterways Journal started publishing in 1880. I'm not, or 1890, sometime in there. But I've seen copies of it that around the turn of the century in the LSU or Louisiana State Archives, and there's all everything you want to know almost. about the industry there. Anyway, that's a resource. Now, in my time, I can't imagine any new configuration. I think I've probably seen everything they've got. When we were working on the Parna and the Paraguay rivers, there were barges there that were built for two purposes. They were, I don't know how wide those barges are. They were probably 190 feet long, something like that, maybe 35 feet wide. They were light barges, but they had kind of a central compartment which we loaded with ore. And at some time or another, they had loaded the void tanks with, I don't know whether it was petroleum or what they put in there, with something else. That we didn't do that, but they were very unstable. They'd turn over on you if you weren't careful. In fact, one of them turned over down at our base in uh, uh, Ladario, I think it was. And if anybody remembers Gerald McDonald, uh, Gerald had experience with this, but the barge was upside down, and Gerald dived down with a leaving line, tied it to one of the timber heads on that barge, and they ran it back over the underside of the barge, and the boat, hooked up to it and pulled it, and the barge flipped back over, which was a neat trick. You couldn't have paid me a salary to do what Gerald did, but Gerald was pretty good. He was a pretty good swimmer, and had done a lot of diving, so he was all
Were,
right with
were
that.
those the good old days that people sometimes refer to?
I No, I don't think so. I, I don't think I can look back. I look back at them fondly. It was awfully hard work, but it was the grand adventure of my life, certainly. But anyway, barges are made all over the place. I can remember one of the crisis situations that the industry went through, as I understand it, was that in the 70s, they were building boats and barges right and left. People were investing in them. You had doctors and lawyers and business people, in little towns like Greenville and Vicksburg, investing in barges. And I guess they realized a lot of money on their investment. It was good. People were making money. But then, we had a downturn in the industry, as we do always, whether it's one commodity or one bulk commodity or another, something, you know, gets slow. And one of the big problems that they had was they had too much equipment. There was one uh, oil company, they were in oil, they hauled mostly oil barges. They they tied up all their boats and their barges. They pretty much went out of business. And I don't know whether those, you tie up a piece of equipment like that, when you get ready to ship it up again, it may not work. It goes down pretty quickly. But we had built too much equipment, and it it took us a long time for all of that equipment to cycle out of the industry, and then new equipment to be built. And you know, there was one company that ACBL wound up buying them in the 90s or the 80s. Valley Line Corporation. They were an old company that had been around a long time. They had a lot of big boats and a lot of barges, and a lot of those barges were just rotten, you know, old barges. You still see them up on the Illinois River, old Valley Line barges, I think. But those barges, if broke a wire, it wouldn't necessarily break the wire. It'd probably been more likely to pull the cable of the timber head up. And because, you take these barges and down in the Intracoastal Canal, you get to mix with salt water going across some of these sounds or whatever, and they start to get rotten pretty quickly, and that's what had happened to those. But once the old cycled out and the new uh, equipment started being built, that's when they shut down all the shipyards. They weren't building. They had St. Louis shipyard. You had Jeff Boat stayed in business longer than most. You had uh, Draveau Meckling in Pittsburgh, near Pittsburgh. You had Nashville Bridge. You had several shipyards who were building. At least a couple of them were building boats in Greenville, and you have others all over the place. Most all of those went out of business, and so that was that. But you still had barges being built, open hopper barges, cover top barges, and I've seen them in all kinds of designs. But as I understand it, it's still fundamentally you're dealing with a raft, and the object is to maximize the loading capacity and minimize the draft, because you have rivers that are to some extent seasonal. We run them all the time now, but in low water, you don't necessarily have the 12-foot channel that they promise you. Sometimes you don't even have the 9-foot channel. And so you're not going to run a ship above Baton Rouge. Not not simply because you can't get it under the upper Baton Rouge Bridge, but because you're just not going to find enough water to float a ship very far up the river from that. So you've got to the only mode is to create these rafts, these big rafts of barges.
Well, you mentioned in our phone call earlier this morning that you do have experience shoving a few different kinds of barges that were sort of engineered in attempts to make things more easily hydrodynamic or more hydrodynamically performative, I suppose. Fill me in on those and what your experiences were. You mentioned, of course, short rakes versus long, and I'd like to hear about all that.
Yeah, well, that's you get, it just depends on who builds the barge and what purpose it is. But I was just looking at a picture online a bit ago of somebody's tow where you had the cover tops, but you had a very short bow, you know, and the bow itself was not very built up very high, so that if you loaded that barge down as much as you could, that barge is going to be sitting low in the water even with a rake. So it's not gonna barges like that. Uh, you got to be careful, with a rough you have rough water that you don't submarine them. And if you have an open hopper barge like that, you get the wind blowing up the river and white caps on the river. You're going to get this spray that's going to blow back 2 barges back, maybe. And you do that all day long, and you're going to fill up a barge and sink. It's what's going to happen.
What have you been your experiences at the Sticks with barges submarining and things like that? Have you?
I've never seen one do that. Knock on
Okay,
wood.
okay,
I've never personally seen. Well, I've sure heard about it.
sure.
I've seen people who had barges fall out right, in front of them. And I wouldn't know what that's like. I wouldn't want to know what that's like.
Do
But
do you have any especially memorable experience that maybe during a storm trying to stop a tow, things like that?
yeah, I'll tell you one. And this is about the most unique barges that I ever worked with, go away, little cat, go on, go somewhere else, was Canal Barge Company got a contract with Seminole Electric and a Florida power company. They had lots of money. So they built, 4 boats and a bunch of barges, and they were what they call super jumbo barges. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Jimmy Gunlock, who was a vice president at Canal at the time and was a marine architect, is the one who designed these barges. And he had to design them for multiple purposes. You had, we loaded out at Mount Vernon, Indiana, so he had to make them where they fit into a tow that would fit with those boats into a 1,200-foot lock. And he also had to make them where you could put uh, a fairly large tow and sit down on the lower. You only had 3 big boats for that purpose. And then once we got to Luling, uh, just above Luling Bridge, that fleet, uh, we dropped those tows, and these smaller boats would take them 2 barge units at the time and go to Florida with them.
Is that Upper St. Rose fleet now?
No, no, it's darn, I can't. It's just above the Luling Bridge on the left ascending shore, right up underneath 26 Mile Point. I can't. It's close where that boat
Is that
sank.
is that
Sank.
Knott's?
No, no, Knott's Fleet's a little further south. This below the bridge down there. If I'm this is I don't know what it is now.
Arco Canizero, maybe? Or is that too high?
That's too high. This is just above the Luling Bridge, just underneath 26 Mile Point.
Or is
That boat we talked
Magnolia
about,
now?
It's probably Magnolia.
Yeah,
That boat
okay.
we talked about that sank,
Right,
that's just above that,
right.
just below that. Okay. Anyway, that's where we dropped those tows, and those were 12 barges. These were big barges. You would have with a 12 barge tow, you had six two barge units, and you had they had a huge rake on them, big long rake, and so that when you put them together right in the middle of the tow, you were rake to rake. So you had a big hole right in the middle of your tow. And that made them difficult. They were actually about, I don't know, 65 or 70 feet longer than a usual a standard, 5 barge tow, and they were heavy. These were heavy barges. So if you had 12 barges, you had more that you had in equivalent in weight, I think, to 30 barges. Now, these boats were wonderful boats. They were short, but they were jet boats, and they had 20-cylinder EMD engines in them. So very powerful boats, and they handled good for being short boats. They handled their stern very good. Usually, a short boat, you were just is you got to really be careful of getting too much quarter on them, and you would have these two, but they did a good job. And it was like my old friend Simpson Kent used to say, when you went full ahead on those 20-cylinder EMDs, it felt like that Delta flight out of Baton Rouge. It'd rock you back in your seat. So they were good boats, but they wanted to put 16 barges on it, and I know they asked me and Simpson about it, and we told them, well, you're you're talking about probably you're really pushing it on the capacity of these boats. Uh, Plus, at Canal at that time, we had done some barge lining, but we didn't have a lot of guys there who were, you know, ready to do that kind of work. We really didn't at the time. Uh, and I mean, I had the best pilot of the fleet with me, who was old Simpson, the late Simpson Kemp. You know, he paddled a P-row before he could walk, but Simpson did. But the problem with that was that hole right up the middle. It made those barges slide. I have never seen a tow slide so badly in my life. And northbound with empties and the wind, it was like a flat rock, you know, skipping across the water. It was just, it would put you on the bank. It was such hard work if the wind was blowing with it. And it was mostly because of that hole in the middle, as best I can figure about it. When later on we started picking up at Cairo or somewhere up there an extra string of standard barges alongside, like grain barges or coal barges, even. And actually, that made it a much easier, the tow was much easier to handle, even though that made it heavier. You know, it blocked that hole off so that, you know, it didn't slide quite as bad. You still had the same problem coming back northbound, you know, because you had that hole in the middle. But Jimmy designed that had to design that for special different different conditions, you know. It had to go Ohio River lower intracoastal waterway. So and these man, those barges were heavy, big heavy steel. Uh, you know, they were much heavier gauge steel than you'd find in any other barge.
Were they single skin?
No, no, they
Okay.
had big, strong rakes
Okay.
and void tanks and timber heads. Those timber heads looked like barrels out there. They were waist high or better, you know, and they were strong. So and they had winches on every corner, so they were easy for the deck crew to put together, you know. And it was a great tow, except that you know, for that sliding thing. And back in those days, this was mid 80s, and the river wasn't, you know, you got low water, and you had some places where, you know, that extra length of tow just wouldn't quite fit. You know, it was hard work. There was one place in particular. I'll tell you about this. I'll tell you how strong those barges were. Uh, just above Greenville, you've got this crossing from Tarpley, a bunch of dikes at Tarpley, a little dike field, and goes down to LaGrange, and then makes a turn down by the Lake Ferguson. But back in that day, there was a dog leg. It went to Tarpley and then crossed, made a dog leg over to the left and another log leg to the right down this bend. So it was a double flank. You had to steer down you'd steer that first turn and back up at the second one, and then you'd push out and back up at the lower end. And it was you know, a real chore doing all that. A lot of places were like that back in those days. Uh, but I came down in there one night, and it was a dark night, and those old Seminole barges they were black. They were painted black. And I want to tell you, it was like a black hole. And at the lower turn, there was a kind of pocket, and there was a big eddy that worked in that pocket. You had to be careful because you were coming down in there and you had to get checked down. But sometimes on a turn, you'll get it checked down current speed, and then all of a sudden it'll goose it and pick up speed again. And there, if you did that, you'd get your head down in that eddy. You're gonna get your head in the eddy anyway, but it'd get that head down in the eddy, and all of a sudden you'd be in slack water. And it did. I didn't catch it in time, and that head down. And about the time I caught it, it was just too late. I went full astern, trying to check her down again. But that port barge climbed the hill. I have never seen a barge climb the river. It looked like something from outer space, I swear. I've never seen a barge uh, climb the hill so high and not just stay there. But it did. It went up and it slid off. And when it slid off, I was dead in the water. I was stopped. So it was going to spit me out of that. And I couldn't do anything but come full ahead on it. And I just knew, I knew that I had probably broken every wire on that head, on that barge. But I just said to myself, well, I'm just going to have to leave it here and go back in down below the boat store and get one of those tugs to come get it for me. That was my
Tell
thought.
tell tell me about that moment from the wheelhouse and communication with deckhands and holy shit, guys, hang on, like that kind of moment.
Oh, there was no time for that.
Okay,
I didn't have but one man on watch in those days, and who knows where he was. But although he had a radio and I could get in touch with him, but there wasn't anybody to. There was no. If I had called for help, there was no help.
gotcha,
I was on my own there.
gotcha.
But when it came sliding off, and I had to go, it held together. And I called my deckhand and said, "Go out there, pick that mate, get that mate while you're at it, get him, and y'all go out there and look at that head. And I want to see if because I'm afraid I might have busted a wire out there." And he went out there, him and the mate, and that wire had crawled right up to the top of the timber head, but I hadn't broken a wire on the whole tow. It held together. And I don't know whether I polished the bottom of that barge or not, but it was that barge, as far as I know, is still in service somewhere. It was that those were some. I can guarantee you, those were some tough barges. But that's probably the most unusual barges that I've ever worked with, and they were built for a good purpose. I mean, Jimmy did a great job of doing that. What's become of Mid South had those barges for a while. I'm not sure what they did with them. I don't know. They probably wound up integrating them into their tows, but I don't really know what they did with them. They didn't put them back in 12 or even 16 barge units again, I don't think.
Let's pause right there. Give me just a few seconds. Remind me again, Mr. Kemp's first name?
Simpson,
Simpson.
Simpson Kemp.
All right. When I get back, we're going to get right into that.
Okay.
All right. Just one moment. All right, sir. Sorry about that. We are still recording. I should have paused that before I got up, but nonetheless, I was making some notes as you were talking here this morning
You
or
want to know about Simpson Kemp?
this afternoon. Yes, sir. Please tell me more.
Okay. I love Simpson Kemp. Simpson is one of the sweetest, kindest, best human beings that ever walked the earth. Uh, and he worked most of his career with Canal Barge Company. And I'm pretty sure that if anybody said anything bad about Simpson Kemp around some of those old men I worked with over there, the fight would be on because everybody loved Simpson. Everybody learned from him, and just, it was just my honor to work with him. There are not very many people in this world I feel that way about, but he's passed on now, and I miss him terribly, you know. But he was a good friend, and you talk as a pilot, and he was of all of us who worked over there, he's the only one who had that kind of gift. He's just an artist at it, you know. And I got to watch him. I got to learn from him. You know what little, you know, what I'm a make do pilot. It's about all I am. But a lot of what I learned from watching Simpson.
What were some of those experiences? Like boat handling and crew management type
Uh,
lessons, or
oh, well, I know we no he Simpson wouldn't work he until towards the end of his career. He didn't want to be a captain. He wouldn't take a captain's job because he didn't want to tell people what to do. He didn't want to deal with crew issues and personality issues and that sort of thing, you know. And I understand. I got the same way towards the end of my career. Uh, but he was. He's a very soft spoken man. He was short and barrel chested, a very powerful man, really. You know, you wouldn't know that, but he helped me move one time when I bought a house, and I'll tell you what, Simpson could do some work now. He was a stout fellow, but he uh, he grew up in the Man Shack swamps. You know, they were poor. His daddy, you know, he caught muskrats and mink and whatever, and gathered Spanish moss and fished and did whatever they had to do to survive. You know, and Simpson was one of those people who he grew up paddling a pirogue before he could walk. I'm pretty sure. You know, so as a boatman, it was just in his nature, you know. It was and he just had the eye, and he had the touch. And he told me stories about, I mean, they were poor. They had it pretty rough. But he said his daddy took him down in a place one time in the swamp, and there was a ship, had big cypress trees growing right up through the middle of it. And it was an old fashioned, like a Spanish ship or something, that had blown back in there during a hurricane. And he just said, Simpson, you know where that was? That might have been treasure. He didn't remember where it was. He didn't know we wouldn't know where to find it. But he grew up there and lived in Livingston Parish. Now, he told me a great story one time about him. He had married this woman. He had, from his first marriage, something like 12 kids. And Miss Patsy, his second wife, had about 12 kids too. You know, so by the time I knew Simpson, you know, he had enough children and grandchildren and great grandchildren coming along that, you know, you could have elected a sheriff in Livingston Parish, you know, just with his kinfolks if they'd all voted together. But Simpson told me this story, and say he was real soft spoken, but he had a laugh that was startled you. It was so abrupt and loud, you know. And he was telling me this story about when back before he met Miss Patsy during the time when he was single. Said Simpson used to drink a bit, you know. And see, he went out because they were putting on some rodeo there in Livingston Parish. And you know Livingston Parish, you know, this is rural to say the least. And said this rodeo, they had lights and they had a fence, and places for people to sit, and said he was there, and he said they turned on the searchlight, and they had one searchlight right in the middle of the ring. Said it just sat there for a while, and Simpson said he just decided to go out there and stand in the searchlight. And he walked out there, and people saw Simpson standing in that searchlight. They thought the rodeo was about to happen, and they applauded. So Simpson took a bow, and they applauded some more. So he took another bow. I think he encored several times before the sheriffs came out and grabbed him, walked him off. But he got a big kick out of that. Once upon a time, Simpson had been bad. But he was just a wonderful guy to work with. I can't tell you. I've watched him. We used to joke. I was relief captain on the Seminole Warrior, and we had a great crew on there. Uh, oh man, what a bunch of characters! And there was an old man who was mate on there for a while, Junior Ellis from Philadelphia, Mississippi. And Junior he'd worked in the CCC back in the 30s, but World War II came along and he joined the army. And he was in Germany one time, in and uh, he Eisenhower's Jeep drove by. Eisenhower wasn't in it, but it had all those stars on it. And when the Jeep came by, you were supposed to go to attention and salute it. Well, Simpson didn't want to do that, or Junior didn't want to do that. He kind of stepped back, so then somebody caught him doing that, and he had to do some time in the brig, a couple of days in the brig, for failing to salute Eisenhower's Jeep, and Eisenhower wasn't in it. But Junior came home, went to work on the river. He made whiskey, and he uh, paid for his property and his mama's house by selling whiskey to the Choctaw Indians in Neshoba County, Mississippi. And he was a character. But we had at the Magnolia Fleet office across the river from the fleet one time. We came up there, and there was this little black cat running around. And Junior fed it something. It was starving to death. So we picked it up and brought it on the boat. And we kept it on the boat for a while. We used up a lot of oil dry, for kitty litter. And we named him Fred. And Fred became quite a character. I would leave the pilot house door propped open, and the door to my room open, where we live, me and Fred would come and go back and forth. But one of our engineers was a great cartoonist, and every morning he would draw a little cartoon for me on something when he brought up, the fuel report. And one morning he brought up a piece of cardboard, and he had a cartoon of Fred and Simpson. And Simpson was making the Vicksburg Bridge. And anytime Simpson made that Vicksburg Bridge, he kind of leaned to the starboard, put that body English into it, to keep it up on that pier. And there was Fred sitting on the console right next to Simpson. Fred he liked to watch the pigeons land on the grain barges, but he was sitting there and he was leaning to the starboard too, just like Simpson. I wish I still had that. But anyway, that has nothing to do with the conformation of barges, I'm quite sure.
Well, tell me about the Seminole Warrior and maybe what has become of her, to your knowledge, over the years.
Wow, it burned. Marquette had it for a while, and it burned. I mean, it burned down after. they sold it, you know. But then, oh, Heinz Furlow bought it, I think, or somebody bought it, and I don't recall what they call it now. It's still out there. It's they've changed it up a lot, I think, but it's still there. It's still got those boats had the tow knees were these big hammerhead tow knees that were actually deck lockers. You know, that's where we kept our hoses and our and stuff, the big deck lockers, and that but it still has that. Uh, Tony Gurley was captain on that at one time. I don't know whether Tony's still working or not. And Robert Simmons, who I worked with at Canal Barge Company, he probably worked on that on the boat when it was Seminole. He was pilot on it, but I don't know who's working on it now or who owns it or where it is. But it's still there. It's still out there. And I think Marquette owns. You had the Seminole Warrior, the Seminole Chief. That was the first one that came out, and the Seminole Brave. That was the last one. And but you also had the Seminole Princess. Was they would load the barges at Mount Vernon and try to bring them down the river to meet us at Cairo, although they seldom ever got that far. Mac was that whole family was extraordinary. The with ACBL, uh, the Hester family. You had Mac, Dozier, Alvy, and Roger was the younger one. Then there was one of those who was an engineer. I don't remember his name. Uh, but I worked with all. Well, I didn't. I never did actually work with Dozier. I was at uh, Jeffersonville with him for a week of computer stuff and got to know him a little bit there. But they were, oh man, these were another family who grew up on boats. You know, they were from, if I'm not mistaken, Biola Battery or that part of South Alabama, and
Yes,
so
sir.
they were all on boats all their lives, and they were just consummate boatmen. They really were. All of them were, and just huge respect for them. And Mac was had been a port captain at one time with ACBL, and he he was. I don't know. There was just something about Mac that he carried an authority that few people did. You know, he. This was a serious man in terms of the profession was concerned. He was serious, and he kind of set the bar. I think him and quite a few others. You know, but I guess Mac, when I was there, he was the one that everybody I looked to, and if there was any leadership role, you know, you kind of look to Mac I mean, you had Captain D. O'Donnell, you had Bob Shelton, Stubby Hudson, and just an awful lot of people still around of the senior captains. But uh, Mac, I only got to work with Mac about a week. I relieved uh, my friend Grady Gibbs on the Hendricks one time for about a week. Grady had to be off or something, then he came back and relieved me. So I only got to work with him about a week, but we got along great, and I really liked him. He was extremely intelligent man. Like I say, he was a the consummate professional and set the bar for that. Now, off the boat, he was a different character altogether. I never got to party with him, but I've got real close friends who hung with him a lot. And he was just a bunch of fun to be with, and just a great guy. But on the boat, he was serious, and everybody knew that. And there were deckhands who were terrified of him. If you didn't do your job, or you weren't serious about doing your job, you didn't get much slack from Mac. And he's one of these people who inspired you to do your best, to be your best, and basically that's why I went to work for that company to start with, you know, is that I didn't feel like I could be the professional pilot that I wanted to be where I was. And,
Do
I
you think that exists much in today's industry?
I think it does, I think it does. I think there's a lot of people with ACBL who still have that work ethic. I really do. Who are still serious professionals. I know quite a few of them. I know, at least one of their vice presidents, that Randy is somebody I take very seriously. And so they're there. In fact, my stepson who worked for Canal Barge Company. I got him a job with Canal Barge Company when he decided years ago that he wanted to work on a river because that was a family company, and I knew that he wouldn't be just a number with them, that know who he was, and it was possible to work your way up from the bottom, which is what he did. But, he's wanted to work on bigger tows and bigger boats, and they don't have that, So he just recently went to work for ACBL, and I for the same reason I did. So yeah, I think it's there. It may not be everywhere, but I think all of there are there's some of my generation still there, and then there are some of the people who followed us, who are cut from similar cloth. I think so. Yeah, I do. I feel that these are look, these are professional people, and you look at a place like the Mississippi from Baton Rouge south. People, we've talked about this, what a difficult job that is to navigate in high water, you know, in close quarters with such volatile traffic and conditions, you know, and knock on wood, you have not had very many very serious accidents. You haven't. And I don't know why, but it has to do with the fact that the people who are doing that work, are serious people and they're working very hard at what they're doing. I mean, I believe that it takes a long time to get there. It really does. Even now, even with all of advancements and advantages that you have with the charting systems and all of the instruments and communications equipment and all of that. But it's still it's still a profession that requires you know, it's experiential. You got to have your hands on those sticks. Nobody can tell you how to do it. You have to learn to do it yourself. And when you have those extreme conditions, the companies need to put their experienced people, their most experienced people, in vulnerable positions. That's and I don't know. I don't have as much doubt about the people presently in the profession as I do about the people they work for. I don't know whether these corporations, they've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. I don't know whether they understand the business that they're presuming to manage. That to me is a big danger. If you don't know what you're doing, what's needed, if it's an abstraction to you, then maybe you're gonna, look at profit and instead, instead of expense, or you're going to look at expense in terms of profit. And that bothers me because I don't know that world. That's not my world.
Well, discussions with captains like yourself have certainly opened my eyes over the years. I've been in dispatch roles since 2015 when I joined with AEP. And everybody's a little different. Every captain likes different things, and it's interesting to manage at times, but we do try to have a good time with it.
It's an amazing profession, really, and it is different for all of us. It's one of those professions where somebody can, you don't have to go to college. You don't have to invest $100,000, in becoming a school teacher or something. You can you can don't imagine that it's going to be any easier, you know, to work your way up and learn to be a river pilot. It's not. It's going to be different. It's not going to be any easier though. And but it demands and should demand quite as much respect. I'm not sure it gets that, but it should. Because it's not an easy thing to do. You're not navigating from point to point. It's not like like blue water work, where you got to figure set and drift, but you're not navigating from here to here. You know, it's not like a flying an airplane, from here to there. This is you're in nothing's still in a river. Nothing's the same one trip to the next. It's always different, and it's fluid. Who was it? I forget which physicist said that if he ever finds himself face to face with the supreme being, he's got two questions. You know, one is why uh, uh, the Einstein formula. Why why that? And the other is why uh, chaos, the chaos of flowing water, and that's how I'm not saying it right, but that's what he's talking about. Because it is chaotic. It's not something that stands still for you, and where you are in it means everything. Your aspect, you know, and it's not an easy thing to do. And nowadays they've got some big boats, but they still don't push, but so fast through the current. So when you make Vicksburg Bridge, you're not pushing out. You're positioning the boat so that it falls in between those piers. And that's something different altogether, It's not just boat handling, it's more than that.
Oh, I don't mean to minimize any bit of it, sir. And I have a
Oh,
massive respect for what's done. And even at the fleet level, one and two barges at a time,
oh,
it's extraordinary.
oh, you wouldn't believe, I've tried to do some of that fleet stuff, and I don't want any part of it. My hat's off to those guys, who take one barge or one little boat and snake that stuff. That's amazing work. None of this stuff is easy. I don't care where you work, None of it is easy. It all has its challenges. If you work on the upper Mississippi, you work on the Illinois River, if you work on the Ohio is kind of nice sometimes when you got those, low water and pool stage river, uh, you know. But look out when it's high, when the gates are all out. That's a different animal altogether, And lower Mississippi and God knows the Missouri, although I don't, there's not much traffic up there. Captain Dave Dewey still works up on the Mississippi, on the Missouri. That's a, I wish I had that experience, but, uh, some of the best pilots I've ever worked with were old Missouri River pilots.
Well,
But
I'm working on trying to get Dave Dewey on here one of these days, but
oh, you need to.
I
He's this guy he's one, first of all, he's one of the best bosses I've ever had. I worked for Dave for a while, and if you got a problem, all you had to do was pick up the phone and call Dave Dewey, and I don't care what department you were in, whether you were talking about or what river you were on, or what the issue was. He knows the whole business. He could do an overhaul. He can work on a Missouri River. He could take a tow down the lower, whatever you're talking about. And plus, he is a really good businessman too, and plus he's just a nice guy. He's a great guy to work for. So I hope you can get him because, I can't imagine, I don't know anybody that doesn't have a whole lot of respect for Cap Dave.
and one of these days I do hope to. But one more question, I think we can wrap this up. Uh,
Okay.
a special interest to me, and I know one specific listener that is pretty faithful, especially to your stuff. Um, Tell me about your experience working in fleets.
Oh, I I don't remember what this was. Uh I, I was floating around one time, uh myself and a young pilot I trained, Manny Garcia, and I forget what it was. It was down in the Gulf Division, and the port captain, they tied the boat up that we were on, and the port captain, he was going to send me somewhere else, but he was going to put me up somewhere for a couple of days, and he asked me if I'd work on a one of the tugs and in the fleet, and I did, and I told him the next day, get me off this damn thing. I don't want any part of this. I can't even sleep on here because you're bumping and banging and you're lying in bed and you feel them pulling on a line and that boat leaning over, and in these big boats that's not something you're accustomed to feeling in the middle of the night when you're half asleep. If you're feeling that boat's about to sink, so I told her to get me off this damn thing. But when I first went, I got a first relief captain job with ACBL. I worked with Nolan Strong down in the Gulf Division for ACBL on the Richard C. Young. And man, Nolan's another one of these guys. I just learned so much from him. He was a serious guy, serious pilot. You know, he he got in a fleet and he didn't sit around with his feet propped up. You took that big boat and you get out in the fleet and you worked. So if what fleet work I had really was with a 5,600 horsepower boat, which is not real fleet work, but what little experience I had actually working on a fleet work, I want any part of it. And I hats off to those guys because they are working hard, especially if they're also living on a damn boat. If it's that's hard work. Now I did when I was back in 1980, when I was doing graduate work at LSU, I did work a few nights and weekends for Capital Fleet on a tug. Mostly it was just sitting around, but I did work on tugs with them a little bit, trying to keep enough money to keep me in school.
So was it Capital Marine at the time?
Yeah, uh-huh.
Tell me,
Yeah.
tell me about working for them and working in the fleet there, because the individual I'm talking about is on lead boat there now.
Uh, boy, I'm trying to think of the guy's name who I knew there, who I talked to. Really nice guy. His background was on steamboats, and he worked for a while with the uh, it's a simulator in Paducah at what is his name? I'm drawing a blank. I'm sorry. I apologize to him for not remembering his name. He was
That
in
wasn't
charge.
that wasn't Bill Grantham, huh?
No, no, it
Okay.
wasn't him. No, he 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 was he was in charge of the Seamen's Church at Paducah for the last time I saw him, but I don't remember his name. But he's the only person I really knew at that fleet, and I didn't do much work for him. I really didn't. I was pretty busy.
Okay. Well, I think we can leave it there, sir. I do appreciate your time here yet again. I'll keep you posted on progress with the rest of the stuff that we've already recorded.
Okay, thanks very much. Enjoyed it.
Thanks very much, sir. See you next time.
Okay, bye.